Hi, this is Phil Kaveny with another installment of my project. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I'm politicizing myself with a very strong left-wing, actually 60s kind of view of the world. I'm getting involved with an Eau Claire group that's really concerned about net neutrality. One of my members, John Walker, who is a millennial friend of mine, and another member is the former chairperson of the Eau Claire City Council, Carrie Kincaid. And like so many things we have, so many privileges we have, we view them as entitlements, and we think things were always like that. Now, I have about a 43-year career in alternative media, in radio, in television. I was practically a founder of Radio WORT in Madison, Wisconsin. And I want to tell a story about my dear friend of a lifetime, James Andrew Cox. He's now the distinguished and editor emeritus of Midwest Book Review, which is one of the most respected book reviews in the country. But he and I are like the Russians who have eaten a pood of thoughts of salt together to get to know each other. So I'm going to go back probably 1975. And at that time, we had a radio station in Madison, Wisconsin, founded by John Oliger, late John Oliger, and he had the credentials to be a media executive or an academic department head or just about anything he wanted. But what he did was he had a commitment to a community and putting technology into community hands. Well, I remember one morning after we had set up to have 2 or 3 radio shows on WORT, which was a community radio station where different communities could talk to each other. And we produced some very successful and award-winning shows. And it was our morning at 6 a.m., probably on a very cold December morning, I'll say it's in 1975, when it was our job to go into WORT, which was then located on Winnebago Street in Madison, Wisconsin. We had a transmitter tower about 120 feet tall. And I like to jokingly say, and Jim had to climb to the top and turn the light switch on, but the little thing to keep airplanes from hitting on it. But actually all we really had to do was unlock the station, go in and turn a bunch of switches in. I said, you know, Jim, what we're doing and we're taking for granted, people have fought and died to be able to do. I mean, you've heard of the radio-free radio stations, you've heard of underground radio stations. There are parts of the world where you could die if you have the wrong radio channel on. I think if you're a citizen of North Korea, then you have to have a radio in your house and everybody has to listen to the same program. Well, I guess there is coming out of the Trump administration a way of making net neutrality disappear. And what net neutrality pretty much means is that all content gets a fair shake. There used to be something like this as far as equal time for political candidates. There were FCC equal time rules, and if you were the Koch brothers and you spent like millions of dollars to try to rig an election, then somebody else got that much free time. But that's not happening anymore, and that makes it a lot easier to buy an election. I'm reducing this a little bit. But what I mean to say is if net neutrality becomes even more restricted, and it's certainly not perfect now, we're going to have less access to the internet. Now, what that's important for me is this. I'm a public intellectual. I'm a film producer. I have a YouTube channel, and I work with a brilliant crew of young people who helps me get my work out. And what's happened recently is I came upon the work of a psychologist. His name is Daniel Kahneman, and he won the Nobel Prize in economics for developing something called prospect theory. And prospect theory does nothing less than attack the grounding assumptions of economic theory that have been placed for 120 years by saying that in indeterminate situations, people don't always make the optimum choice. They don't act like the economic man or woman, but they act in a way where they trade a very small gain for the possibility of a much greater gain in the future. Let me put this into a more accessible format. My late father-in-law, Joe Bogstad, at one particular time had a certificate of deposit at Wells Fargo Bank, which was getting a horrible low rate of return, something like a $20,000 certificate of deposit, and he was getting 1% on it. And I said, you know, Joe, you should really cash that in and get the 2% you could get anyplace else, because that's going to be like several $100 added income in a year. And he wouldn't do it because there was a $20 redemption fee if he cashed in the low yield certificate of deposit. Well, that's one part of prospect theory which I can talk about, because I was able to watch this Nobel Prize winner in economics synopsize various aspects of the decision-making process and some really interesting aspects of cognitive process. And I can tell you that the stuff that I studied, because Google put this up on the internet, Professor Kahneman was kind enough to make his content available, has had direct policy implications in the way I run my life. One of the things that he talks about is in thinking slow and thinking fast, or switching it around, is different kinds of cognitive processing. And type 1 cognitive processing is almost mechanical, almost out of instinct. You get a hunch and you act on it, and many times you can't really suppress it. But it takes a certain level of energy, of what we call now cognitive inputs, which is something that is measurable through a device called the pupil perimeter meter. And this maps cognitive energy expenditure by looking at the width of people's pupils. So in other words, if I'm talking to someone, if I'm talking to a class, and all of their eyes were dilating rather than glazed over like they are most of the time, then I would have a pretty good idea that they were thinking, and they were actually thinking about what I was talking about, rather than maybe looking at cat pictures or something like that. Well, this also told me another thing. He was recounting some of his other experiences. And by the way, It is my intention through the internet to dialogue with this guy because he seems to know an awful lot of about chess, decision-making processes for chess players, and he also knows a lot about playing Go. Well, on occasion I won the University of Wisconsin chess championship, and I'm sort of the unofficial chess champion of Eau Claire. And I want to talk to him about cognitive processing and the decision-making process as far as deciding which chess or Go moves to make. And one of the things I've noticed, which sort of verifies his theory, is I can play 30 games on the internet simultaneously with players that are my strength or a little bit weaker than me, and win most of them. But if you put me against a strong player, I function much less effectively, because this is an activity that demands type 2 cognitive processing. Now, I've run a little experiment, and if you're listening to this, Professor Daniel Kahneman, I noticed that as I was listening to your lectures and I was studying your material and reading your book, I was playing Go on the side. I do this. This is part of one of the functions of what I like to do. But as I listened and paid attention to this groundbreaking theory, I noticed that my Go handicap increased by several stones. In other words, it was in fact measurably harder for me to do two high-level cognitive tasks at the same time.